Okay, so who here uses Postman? I know somebody mentioned, but yeah, raise your hand. Okay, cool. And who here uses other tool, maybe not automation, but manual API testing tool? Okay, other than Postman. Gotcha. Okay, I'm not sponsored by Postman in any way, but I know we have cool prizes and I appreciate the support. I would like to thank Nielsen for providing hosting this event as well. A little bit about myself. I've been in QA about 5.5 years. I started out in as a manual tester on the U-Test. I've done a lot of mobile application testing, mostly functional, UI, that kind of stuff, and it became boring to me pretty soon because especially with regressions and manual testing, you run into this, same flow, same test cases, and you get burned out pretty quick. That's why I started looking for automation opportunities, learning about automation, and my first company, full-time company, was here in Tampa, and that's where I got introduced to Postman. We had both web and mobile applications for testing, and our mobile application was utilizing multiple APIs. Some of them were public APIs, some were developed by our company, in-house APIs. It was a .NET shop, so everything was Windows web services, and testing was in C# as well as Visual Studio and Postman. And why Postman? Well, first of all, for me, it's very intuitive. It's very easy to learn. It's free for the most part. Like up to date, I've never used or never had a need to use a paid or subscription version of Postman. Because the free version was more than enough for me, and we will cover all the all the functionality that's available for a free version. That's what I'm using, but let's get to it, guys. So let's see if I can go back to my slides. Yep. Okay, we have the screen, but I can't really operate it for some reason. Let me maybe switch to a different mode, different screen, mirror. Okay, you see it? Okay. Okay, so what is API? Anybody, please?
Application Programming Interface.
Okay, that's a good one. And can you elaborate a little bit on it? So, application programming interface, what does it do? What is it? I mean, what you gave me is basically the definition, right?
It's a backend part of it.
Okay, it's a backend. What else? Anybody else?
To me, an API in layman's term is kind of like a waiter. You go to a restaurant, you sit down on a restaurant, on a table, look at the menu. You need to order food from the back, from the kitchen. The API is like a waiter. He comes over, takes your order, communicates with the kitchen.
Okay.
The kitchen tells you what to,
Okay.
the kitchen gives the food.
Yeah. So basically, it's a tool that helps communicate, right? It helps deliver some resources to an end user or a backend system such as a database, right? Very good. Good definitions. And API, as we've already heard, stands for Application Programming Interface. We all know what UI is. It's a user interface. Is what everybody interact with on a daily basis, right? When we use our devices, our computers, our phones. Programs or software also communicate, and there has to be a way for different software components or systems, even from different vendors, even to integrate, to communicate, to exchange information, right? And that's where API comes in, and basically it provides that interface for other programs, for other softwares, in order to parse data, to redirect data, and to store data, it's not storing, it's directing into a database where it's stored. Okay, let's have a brief introduction to a RESTful API. And why RESTful API? Because we know there's this is the most popular, that's what everybody is using, and companies like Facebook, GitHub, Google, they all provide their APIs, endpoints for others to interact with, and they're all using REST protocol or HTTP. So Postman as a tool only works with RESTful APIs. It's limited to working with HTTP client interface, and so what is REST? Is a representational state transfer. So the way we can describe this application is basically we don't store any data. We allow ways we manage resources. We allow resources to be stored and directed to different sources using HTTP commands. Now, let's summarize, right? And by the way, I have if you answer this question, I have a prize for you. So, who can tell me what is a REST API? We just covered some basics of it. Anybody? I just want to make sure you get this, and yes, there's a quiz, even if you're not ready.
It's architecture.
About what?
Architecture.
Yes, it is a module or an architecture, but can you elaborate a little more on it? What it does?
REST uses multiple cases: HTML, JSON, XML as well.
Okay.
Or SOAP uses only XML.
So basically, it manages resources, it redirects resources, and that's what REST is used for. Perfect. Ruslan, here you go. Sorry, I'm a good thrower. All right. All right. So, anybody else? Before we move on, I have this nice pin from Heroku. So you can just add to the question because there's more. There's more to cover.
That is unified interface to work with backend, to get that data from backend to any kind of platform, whether it is mobile application or web interface, like web browser-based websites.
So basically, different commands or actions are used, right, to administer those resources. Right, perfect. And the protocol that's used is HTTP, which is what's commonly used for any browser or web application as well. All right, let's move on. This is just recap of what we already talked. Here is the very simple diagram, guys. This is really, in your systems in production, this is probably not going to happen because we have multiple clients that we work with, right, as a server application. There's on your left is going to be your mobile device, is going to be your operating systems of different clients and browsers. The middle section here is all about functionality of API and the way it manages resources. And then we see that there's a database handler that's either storing data or retrieving data from the database and delivering it back to our client. So you guys have a better visual understanding of what's going on. So we've already mentioned that to manage the data, different HTTP methods are used, and these are just some of them. There are more than than this, but these are the most commonly used ones. Okay, so we have our post, and here on your left there's a CRUD, which stands for create, write, update, and delete, and these are basically actions that the methods invoke, right? So to create a resource, we commonly use post. To retrieve the resource, we use get, and then update or replace, we use put. To patch is for update and modify. Now there's difference between put and patch. You need to realize that when you use it, guys, that put actually replaces the original resource, so you don't want to mess it up, and if you're not sure, I would rather use patch so in order to keep the original resource and just update it. And then there's delete, of course, is when we completely remove that resource. Next is status codes. Now this is what we use with Postman, or you could use it if when you write your tests and assertions. That's what I use on daily basis as well. Now again, on your left we see the status code and the message. So 200, and this is true for your browser as well. This is a standard. And on your right there's a description. So basically what we work with is your left column is what we're gonna be asserting, what we're gonna be looking at. That's what the server returns to us. And then your right is just an explanation for you to get an idea. Okay, let's move on. Postman uses several JavaScript libraries, and I'm only going to talk about 2 of those today because they are available out of the box, so you don't even need to initiate them or require them in your script. They are already coming in as a part of a sandbox, and one of those libraries was recently introduced as Faker. And when I started with Postman, they only had like 4 dynamic variables. Now today there is at least 100 of those available, and this is just some of them that we are going to be using today, so you get acquainted. And again, on your left is the variable, and you can see that in order to initiate that variable, you need to place it in double curly braces. And there's a description and also the example of a return value that it will generate for you. And what's nice about it, like I said, it's already coming pre-installed with Postman. So another library I use is Lodash. Now Lodash is my personal favorite, is because it takes complex functions and it is letting you use small snippets really to utilize the functionality. I use them a lot with arrays, different data type objects, such as strings, integers, and so on and so forth. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. Again, for you to get acquainted before we dive into code, so you can, recall for what we're going to be using. So on your left is actual method, and Lodash provides again hundreds of those, and simply an example. You can see the code snippets or an example, so how you can use those methods and the expected output as well in the example session. I'll leave it on as I talk so you can get familiarized with it. For more methods, you can go on their website. It's here on the bottom, and you go into docs section and start using it. Really, you, like I said, you don't need to require that library. You just start coding. That it's that simple. Really, you parse your array, you parse your response body, and you work with it. You do whatever you need to do with it. All right. Any questions before we jump into a project? All right. So today we're going to be using an application that's really simple. Basically, it's a Ruby on Rails application that creates content such as articles and comments to an articles. In order to use those features, a user has to be registered. User has to log in order to create the content. So it's a nice little application, and based on it, I created a flow. So, as usually, right, as QA, we start with like end-to-end flow. You know, it's a happy path, right? We're making sure that all the main components of our application, they're functioning and they're integrated, and the end user can utilize our application, right? So I already started the server, and we can go to Postman. I created a collection, and we will go over the UI real quick so you can understand. Like I said, it's really intuitive. It's really easy to use because they provide this nice interface for you. So if we go here, on your left, you can see all the collections. Now, collections are meant to, it's like think folders, right? They contain all the requests where you can organize your test cases, right? You can actually save your test cases there and run them. There are several ways to run. We'll get to it. But first, if you look there, the flow here I created starts with registration. Then we have some negative tests there where we're making sure that the application returns the correct response, error message, so forth. Then we use our registered user to log in. My application uses token system. So as soon as user logged in, he gets token assigned, and that token we're going to store into environmental variable and reuse it, as well as some other components that we're going to be need as we progress. We will create new articles. We will make sure that we cannot create any content without token. Again, some negative tests here. We will test some increments, like increments, to make sure that counts are incremented, that IDs are unique, and so forth. We will test retrieving content. As you can see here, different methods are used to post or create. We use post. To get or retrieve, we use get. Right? Okay. Any questions? No? So as you can see here on your right, the main window has several tabs. We're only going to be using like some of them. We're not going to touch all of them. On top here, you can see the different environments that you can set up. Since my application is running locally, I don't have to do that because you only need that if you already deployed your application and then you have multiple servers or endpoints that you will work with. The way this organized or set up is just one file that contains all the tests. And the way we do it in our company, it's just one file, and then we have separate files for each environment in order to maintain just one file with tests. And there is a way to set up Jenkins to run different jobs against different environments, and that's what we're going to be covering today as well. But for now, all you need to know is that there's just one environment, and I don't even need that, to be honest with you, because it's running locally. Here, authentication tab is not used at this point because really we don't need any authentication for registration, right? We would like to allow anybody to register. My application requires some attributes that in order to process the request and register a user has to provide login password, and this here is not required, but it's nice to have. So avatar, URL, and the name is required. As you can see here, we already pass in variables that are in curly braces, and that's common way in Postman, and you can call those variables from anywhere, whether it's an authorization tab or headers tab, body, pre-request, test, from anywhere you can call them, and they will be used. Pre-request script tab is used to generate data, to create data, to set up your test basically. As you can see here, we're using JavaScript, and we use global variables such as full name, and then for login here we're gonna take that full name that's generated by Faker. We're gonna remove all the spaces and use it as login, right? And it's gonna be passed here in our request body. For our password, we use a function that has a string of characters that will be randomly assigned and then retrieved. And this function here is for characters to be randomized and set to random number. The length is 10. You can change this to any number that your application requires, right? You can even further modify this script in case your application has strict rules for upper, lower case, and special characters to be present there, the length of the password. All of this can be modified, but for our purposes, this is this is good. And next one is, again, we use a global variable from Faker library just to generate the avatar image and then the URL. So we don't have to worry about scripting this, we just call it. Now the console here on the bottom is just for debugging purposes, and Postman actually uses console that we will be using to debug and print our values to make sure that we work with good data, right? Because good tests, no matter how good they are, they need to be tested also, right, to make sure they work properly. Okay, so again, this is pre-request. This is where we set up stuff before we run our requests, and then the test tab is after the call, is when we work with the return data. And again, I wrote just simple coverage, just some tests to make sure that we don't return any empty values, and that data return matches the data we generated. Again, here we use Lodash here, and you can see, like, you can just simply call Lodash function there, and you don't need to preset up anything. These variables here, they're just local variables. They're going to be used in this tab, and the ones that I need to reuse, I initialize them in a different way. I I set them as environmental variables, which then can be further retrieved and used for our assertions or built in our requests. Okay, so as we run, and then I'll switch to console. As we run this, as you can see, we got the response, we got our tests passing. Console returns all the data we generated that's printed. You can also see your request body that you actually sent. You see the password, the login. Login came from name, right? That space was removed, and it was all set to a lowercase. Again, you can modify it further the way you need, the way your application requires it. But at this point, that's how I done it, and set it to lowercase. I removed that space for login. What else? So we can see a console is a great tool for debugging, because sometimes your tests are failing and you have to use console to see what those variables are, to see what data there is, or is there any. Right. Tabs below show you your tests. They represent the description here, and that's what's going to be printed on the report when we get there. That's going to be printed in your Jenkins console as well. When you work in your Agile teams, that's what you can use to share your results, to make them visible. Any questions, guys? Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, so where do you declare these variables? In pre-request part?
So
are variables being declared?
Yes, some of them are coming from pre-request, and some are actually declared here in test tab, because they have to do with the response body. So in order to generate them, you actually have to receive a response back from the server. Now the ones that are in pre-request, you don't need the response, because that's what you're setting up your test for.
So basically you declaring and assigning values in that step, right?
Yes, this is for the values that are used for our request body. Also, what I'd like to point out that you can also use this button here to see your variables, but this is only for your environmental variables, so you will not be able to see any local variables there. And this is also nice for debugging, because then you can just switch to this and see what's been generated. You don't have to go to console for that, or print it out, because it's going to be there for you. Okay, so we have our simple tests, really. Let's go over real quick so you get an idea what we're doing here. Our response, as you can see, has different attributes, and that's what we're testing. So first we're making sure that the ID is present, right? Now I could write this in other different ways, but this is just easier, because a low dash, it actually lets you check against null values as well as empty strings, so you don't have to combine those assertions or use complex assertions. You just call this function and you pass the ID, which is, if you drill into a response, it's right here, and you're making sure it's not empty. Now if I change that, which means that it is expected to be empty. Of course this is going to fail now because the ID is present, right? Okay, next is we're making sure our controller or our resource we are using is called users. and that's the assertion here for. Then we test our attributes. We're making sure they match what we generated and passed in the request. Okay, moving on. We just created our user, and if we go here on the server, we can see actually that the user was created. We can see it in the logs, or we can query to see our last user, which I'm not going to be doing because we don't have much time, and I would like to be able to cover this flow. Next test is a negative test. What we're doing here is we're actually passing all the existing data, the same password we just generated, the same user. So we're reusing those environmental variables from the first step, and we send this pretty much the same request. Now, of course, our application is supposed to reject that because we already have that user created, right? And that's what we expect. Pre-request is empty. We already generated all our stuff in the first step, so we don't need to bother do it anymore. Here is our test. We set the response body to a variable, and we parse it. We're making sure that the response code is 422, and the comment there is the unprocessable entry. We also making sure there is a valid error message returned. Now I have two examples on how you can test this, and you can either use a local variable, or you can actually assert like the whole response body, or just a specific field in the response. So the first one is where we just use a specific field error, which is much cleaner. Or if you don't want to bother, you can just check the whole body. Again, if we run this, we get the status 422, which is expected. We get our message and error. As you can see, the detail or error message here, which is a detail, has the message we expect. As you can see here, the way this local variable created is from the array. So we had to actually point to a specific place in the array in order to retrieve. Here you can see errors array. It has details. That's what we need to verify. I didn't touch this last portion here, and I would like to cover it real quick with you. And this is just something I wrote custom script to make sure that if our request fails, we get an error message. We also print our request and response in order to debug it easily, because if there's an error, right, we want to have an output. We want to be able to see what went wrong. Okay, and there's a message too. So if I fail it, for example, let me clear the console. Okay, so if I fail this now, of course our test didn't run because we broke the script. It didn't even get to tests because it broke on this line here. Now we have a message here that returns an error that caused this script to fail, as well as our failed request and our failed response and the code. And that's what I want to see. I mean, you can further customize this, but that's what I need for my purposes. I want to see the code. I want to see the request and response. Okay, moving on. And this is our negative test, by the way. It's also nice to have those, right? Now the login. Login has to do with the user we just created. So we're gonna be again reusing our our environmental variables from step 1, and you see that didn't change. We have same password, we have the same login. The point of this test is to get a token, right? So that's what we need to create our content. As you can see, there's no pre-request because we are reusing our variables here. Now the tests here are to verify that the token is present, that it was returned, otherwise we can't continue. That we again hit the right resource that we need, and that is access tokens. That token is returned, and this is the this was an ID, yeah, and this is the actual token. And then the status. Let's run this. Look at our response body. You see the attribute that has a token. Here we are storing that token into a variable that's going to be reused in our further tests. Again, we create local variable and we store it into environmental variable to be reused. We have our resource name, we have our ID, all of our tests looks good. We have a valid code returned and the message. Okay, let's look at our environmental variables. There is our token. Beside the token, we already have our user ID as well. Now user ID, it came from registration right here, and we're also going to need that in order to retrieve our resources that we create with this user in the future. So that's something we're gonna use later on in our flow. Okay, next step is our negative test. The negative test here is to make sure that we are not going to authenticate any user that does not exist in our database. So instead of sending the login that exists, we just send the word login, and I know I don't have this user, and of course the password is not going to match even if it exists because it's generated randomly. So we just pass the string here. We pass the string login with existing password that we're reusing here, no pre-request. And our tests are making sure that we're unauthorized, that 401 code is returned, the valid message is returned, and we informing our user that his credentials are wrong, and the credentials must be provided in order to receive the token. Now this part doesn't change, this is just for debugging. Okay, let's run our request. And yes, as expected, we get our status 401, message unauthorized, and our messages here. Okay? Any questions? Yes?
I see that you're using some code in different test cases. Is there a way in Postman to extract those, let's say, methods?
Yes.
And then use
That's-
reference to the method?
That's a good question. You see a lot of code has been reused, right? And commonly, that's what you do in your IDE. You just create separate method and you call that method. Unfortunately, in Postman, there is no such way to do it. And that's a pain. That is a pain. But you know what? It's still nice to have at least this capability. Maybe in the future, they'll come up with something like it where you can initialize all your methods and then just reuse them by calling them.
In this case, this tool will become an IDE.
Yeah. Well, Postman, it is an IDE, but it has its shortcomings, and hopefully in the future they will be changed. Improved.
So you're copying, pasting the same method into every request?
If it's required in the request, yes. Yes.
So you have this flow, registration, another registration login. So can you run them sequentially, or you have to manually execute each step separately?
That's a good question, and we will get to it. We will get to workflow management. There are several ways, at least 3 ways that I can show you on how to run this automatically, as well as how to manage the order and the flow, because all these requests, they don't have to be run in the same order they appear. You can rearrange that the way you want, and there is a script for that I will show as we go on. Okay, but yes, to answer your question, yes, we can.
By the way, if, for example, you do registration, so if you will run it a couple of times, are you cleaning the data after?
That's a good question too. Postman provides a way to clean your variables, and we're gonna touch that as well, because as you can see right now, all the variables are there because we need them. Now, further steps will have some cleaning, because we don't want to, we don't want to reuse that data anymore. It's not needed anymore. So yes, thank you for your question. Okay, next step is first time when we are using get method here, and that is just to get articles. Now for this, you don't really need anything except for being a logged in user. So we just pass our token into authorization tab. Now you can see Postman provides different types of authorization here. What we use is a bearer token, and that's again our variable, as we're going to be passing to authenticate our user. There is no body here because we don't send anything, we retrieve data. Okay, as you can see, the URL here is for articles. Now it's gonna return not all of the articles, because the way our application is set up, we only return 25 articles at a time. I already have over 100 there, so but we don't want to load all of them on the same screen, right?
And authorization goes there through the headers, right?
You can use the headers, yes. You can use it's the way your application is set up. You can even use your request body to pass your user and password. You can use your headers. I use this tab is because it's easier for me. So
yeah, but
your headers, yes, you can use it. Yeah. Yeah, you can add those and then pass them here as well. Okay, so go into our tests. For this test, we only making sure that we return articles and that there is exactly 25 of them returned. Again, Lodash here is a great help, because I don't need to write a complex query, and to use a filter from JavaScript. I can just use Lodash here to first of all, we store our data into an array here, and then just use Lodash to make sure to count the data, and that is right here on this line. So first we grab our response. Let me run this for you. As you can see, there's lots of data returned, right? But we need to make sure that 25 of them exactly. So we put it into array, and we use size underscore dot size, and we pass our variable array here to return a count. And then we making sure here in this test that it's exactly 25. Okay, and as you can see, test is passing. Again, if I change it to something else, it's not gonna pass anymore, because we know that number is 25. That's the way our application is designed. Okay, one more thing we're doing here is we're setting up data for our next request in our flow, and that is an article ID. I'm going to use this ID here This very first one, that's the last article that was created in order to test our increment. So when we create new article, we want to make sure that our ID increments. And so this value here will be used, and as you can see here, it's already been stored in our environment, right? It's going to be used to compare later on. Any questions?
Why are you using var? Var, not len or const.
Yes, because when I started working with Postman, that's what it was. Yes, it was 5 years ago, and I don't like changing stuff unless I have to. It works. Like this, guys. By the way, I can show you something here too. Tests. It's also the syntax has changed already. But you know what? The legacy syntax still works, and I'm lazy to go and change every request if I don't have to. Like if you go to Postman is actually providing very nice snippets. And if you go and you see that even for tests the syntax already is different, but this works, so I don't bother.
But you should know JavaScript.
Yeah.
It works, don't touch it.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So new article. Again, to create content, we need to be logged in, right? So we use our token, and here is our body. We provide type and attributes that are required by our application. We need title to be present, we need content, and we need slug. Now, slug is used to make your URL prettier. It's just the content. Instead of ID, right, you return the content of, for example, your title of your article could be a slug. Pre-request script is used here to generate that data. We're going to be sending as a title and content. And again, this is just the test data that I use. Those faker variables here just to combine some random data and send as a title. Then the slug is going to be basically our title set to lowercase, and all the spaces replaced with dashes, and our content is just a bunch of random words. Okay, let's run this and see what happens. Okay, before I go into tests, I want to show you the response. We see that the article ID and controller type, our title, our slug is the same as the title, but now it's formatted to look nice in your URL, right? And we have our content, which is just a gibberish bunch of words. Let's go to our tests. Our tests making sure all those attributes are returned and they are again matching data we generated. Here I actually give you an idea on how complicated this can be if you don't use, for example, Lodash library. You actually have to write something like this to make sure that your, for example, title is not empty, that your value was saved, right, in the database. So you would have to, put it in a variable, make sure that the length is, greater than 0, and that it's not null. Lodash is just uses underscore dot not null and not empty. I'm sorry, and it does the job, so you don't have to write all those complex assertions for you. Okay, we have our slug, and this again just an example for you to see how it can be done, but you don't have to do it that way. We have our valid data returned, that is the data we generated. You can see we have a lot more variables now stored here that we're going to be reusing. we still have our user ID. We still gonna need our token. Our article ID is gonna be used for the steps ahead. Okay, let's move on. Now this is a negative test. Again, it's also nice to have those. If you have ability or time to create those, it's nice to have. What we do here is we pass all the valid attributes that's required, but one thing is missing, and that is authorization. You see there is no token that we provide. Now if we run this, then we get not authorized, we get our status and our message that we have no right to access this resource, and that's exactly what we verify here with our assertions. Okay, forbidden, 403, not authorized. Also here is where we clean the things we no longer need. So, because we're not gonna be reusing, we're gonna create a new article next, and that has to be unique for our testing purposes. So you can see there are less variables here now because some were cleaned. Next step is incrementing, and that is just to make sure that the ID is now incremented. So as you see here is 117, right? But as soon as we add new content, then we expect. Yeah. Sorry, that was a user ID. Yeah, 132 is an article ID, and we see that our test is passing, and other assertions are. We are making sure we return OK status and 200 code. Next is adding comments. To add comment, we need an article ID. And that comment is going to be, there's a relationship to article and the user. And that's starting to get interesting because we're gonna have to test some nested data, nested arrays. So when you go in your response, it's gonna look a lot more complicated now. Okay, here we use our token. So that's the same user we created. Now this user creates a comment for our article. And as we send this, before we do it, let's look at the data we generate. Again, it's same stuff because really we don't need anything much to test this, right? We create title, content, and slug similar to article. We send this, we get the response. The response here, you see it has some relationships to an article. It has an article ID, type articles, which is a type of resource we're hitting, we're retrieving data from. We have our user. That's why we needed that user ID. Remember from the very first test, is to use it here in this test. And we have our content of our comment and the ID of the comment itself. In our tests, if we go to tests, let's look at the variables. You can see we have our variables and tests. I break them down so it's easier to maintain. So first is just for comment section that it's created, or the request and comment that the data is valid. Then the relationships and the user, we're making sure that article ID return matching our variable that's used here in our URL, and it's returned, as well as user ID, which is right here. And the next step is to get comments. Again, we want to see that we can go as you as users, you can go on your web browser to a specific URL, and you can receive the data. You can actually see the data returned, and that's what this test is for. Doesn't have any body. We don't send anything. The test is to make sure that we get comments back that are associated with the article. As we send this, we verify that the comment we created earlier that is stored here is actually returned, and yes, it is. So all of this could be done manually, right? But why if you can automate, right? Why if you can only use seconds, really? And you'll be amazed how fast this runs. And as we run this, it just takes really seconds, and that's amazing. That's an amazing part about automation. One more thing I wanted to point out, and nobody asked yet, is about delays. Now I use this test specifically to introduce you to this, the way we can solve this problem. Now Postman provide their own endpoint, which we can call. We can get delay from Postman Echo service, but it only goes up to 10 seconds. Let's say in your workflow you need time between your requests, right, for your server to process the data, and if you send it immediately right away, your tests are going to be failing, and that's the problem I ran into, because locally tests were passing, but as soon as I ran them from Jenkins, I got a lot of failures, and that's where delay comes in. Now you can use something similar to this script and just use the set timeout function and set it to whichever number of seconds you need. But I like to have a plan B in case what happens if this request fails, right? And that's where your question is about about the workflow, and if that fails, of course we want to have another way to get that delay, right? But if it doesn't fail, we don't want to call 2 delays, right? We only need 3 seconds. All right, so as you can see here, the next request, so if everything okay, the status is okay, we use this code, and then if something's wrong, there's no status okay, our server is down or whatever, then we're gonna switch to this step, which is what I talked to you about earlier. It's the Postman resource that you can use, and the way to use it is to set seconds. Again, you can only go up to 10 here, and then it will go to this step. If everything's fine, it's just gonna skip it and just gonna go to a next step, which is step 11. So let's run this. Again, we already ran this, and we got our comment and we verified, and beside all the validations, we utilized our delay, which is 3 seconds, which will be visible when we run tests automatically. Our next step is a data-driven, and yes, you can combine those with your main flow. The only thing is that when you use your, for example, CSV file with multiple rows of data, you would need to have a number of iterations that is matching those rows in your CSV. Let's say your file with data has 10 rows. You'll need to run 10 iterations of Postman, and we don't want to run 10 iterations for all these tests because we've already verified that the functionality is working, right? But we still want to be able to test our CSV that somebody gave us, our product person gave us this file, and they say, well, I need you to create all this test data, right? And you can sit there and manually run those, copy paste them into your request body and process them this way. But what if there's 50,000 of those? How much time is it going to take for you? And this is an actual real story that happened to me. My manager, we've received from our vendor, our third-party partner, we've received several CSVs with thousands of test cases. And in order to process them into our database, to create the test data, to populate our database, it would take months of work. So what I did, I wrote a script that simply took that file, and you could feed that file and process that data overnight. And that was my solution to this. And again, that's why automation is awesome. And my example here is very, very small. I cannot show you that script because everything I develop is a property of my company, and it's intellectual property, so I cannot share that with you. But I mean, if you sit there a couple of evenings, I'm sure you'll figure it out. There's plenty of data online that you can find. Pre-request script is parsing our CSV, and Postman provides a way to do that in the pre-request, where data stands for our file that we are going to configure in our path as we run. But like I said, if our file has multiple rows, but we only run one iteration, only the first row will be executed. That is why the good practice is to move that task into its own collection, into its own folder, and then run that folder separately. Then you can set the number of runs and just use one iteration to process all those rows. Okay, so but for our purposes, this is fine. And again, we see that if there's an error, we're gonna notify in the console, and what we do here is basically creating another article here, but the data is coming from our CSV. So let me see. I just want to open the CSV for you to see the data and how it looks. So basically what it is those names here. The data is just the file, right? Next part is the column name, and you can name it whatever you want. Our file, my file is using this, so the Postman script can actually find it. Let's see if we can open it. Okay. Okay, so as you can see here, guys, we have 3 columns, and there's some content that we're gonna be sending, but like I said, we're only gonna use this first line here. Okay, the next request, before we go into it, let's cover tests. Tests are just the same as we use for our previous step that was creating article. The last step is nice, and I'm really excited about this one, is because Postman actually lets you create mock server, and where you can store expected response. And that is nice, especially for agile teams where requirements are still in development, right? And you don't even have a code available, but you can already start testing it right away. All you have to do is to ask your developer to provide you with mocks and attributes and a response body that doesn't even exist. That functionality is not even there. You can already start testing, writing your assertions, you can be ahead of the game as a tester. You don't have to sit there and wait for that functionality to be developed. And that's where, which is nice, is that the way it works here is you create an example. You can add it here. I already created one, and this is exactly what's going to be returned when I hit this endpoint. Now the endpoint is going to be generated for your collection. If you go here in this tab, you can see that you can mark this collection, and as you click this, you have to be online. Unfortunately, I don't have internet, so this test is going to fail because we actually it requires an external resource, right? Everything we've tested so far was local resource, so we had access to that. But this, of course, is going to fail without internet. But to give you an idea on how to test it, let's go back to our test here. We can use a pre-request script. We don't have to, but if you want to, it's just like a smoke test, you know. Let's just copy that example we've seen, store it into variable, call it expected, and just run it to make sure our resource, we're hitting the right resource. We're testing against the data we want to test against, and you can just simply assert it by comparing your example from the mock server with your hard-coded or mocked body, and it's gonna fail now because, like I said, there is no internet, but it works, and it works really good, and it helps agile teams.
This is similar to CLISA kind of, like CLISA, what it does, like the solid virtualization stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm not familiar with that, but yes, I believe so. Okay, one thing I want to cover is the way we run those requests. So we have this collection, yes?
Just in the interest of time, can we just try to close the next 5 minutes?
Yes. We're done with the flow. To run this, really, you can just go to run, and as you can see here, if you have your collection, you specify the environment, iterations, you can set it all here and run it manually. You can select your file here, right? The one we opened, you can just open it. What's nice is that it automatically reads the number of lines on your file, and it suggests you to do 10 runs, which we're not gonna do because we don't have to. It has to be separate, and then just run against your environment. And as you can see here, it stops for 3 seconds because we have that delay, remember? And then we get the output. It's showing us the mock server test. Okay, so there were no tests run for this one. They were skipped because we didn't hit the resource. That's why nothing failed. Okay, and nice breakdown here. If anything fails, you can just click here. Okay, let's go to our command prompt. Postman provides Newman. Newman is a way to run your test. You can just export those collections, store them, and use your command prompt to run them, which is nice. And the way to do it is we're not gonna cover all of it, but I'll at least show you. So the command could look something like this, where you tell Newman to run your file that you saved, your collection. If we go back here, let me show you real quick. Here is how you save it. You can export it here and then point the location. Okay, so that's your file. Your environment is next. Again, you point where it's located. D stands for data, and that's our CSV, right? N is unsecure. We don't use HTTPS protocol here. This is K is for reporting, and then the number of iteration is N, and then the reporter we use is our JUnit that lets us export into XML, JSON, CSV, etc. We're just gonna use our XML and store our file on in our folder. It will store your file in the folder where you run it from. So if you don't find it, make sure if you run it from desktop, that's where it's gonna be. Okay, so let's copy this command. Let's copy it and run it. Now this here is what you will see, and you can see that request is failing, and that is our mock server because we can't hit it. But you can see the nice output here, right? You can see all of our tests, all of our assertions, console messages that we want to see, right? We print out the content, and we can see our delay. We informing that we've been sleeping for 3 seconds here. We have the output for assertions and time. Again, look at this time. The duration is only less than 4 seconds. That's pretty amazing, right? And we have a detail failure, and that's our server we couldn't hit. Now let's do the same in Jenkins. This is going to be our closing part, the last part. I appreciate your patience, guys. I know that's a lot of information to cover, right? So let me start Jenkins server real quick, and I already created the job. Okay, and I need 2 hands for this. Okay. So let's wait for our server to start, and again it's local, so we don't need to bother. Oops. Okay, try again. Okay, here's our job. Now, if you are tasked with creating that, integrate your tests into your pipeline, you can use Jenkins or another tool, but that's what we use at work. And if we go to our task, we look at configuration. This is pretty much the same command we just ran from our command prompt. Okay, let's go back and run it. Yep, now it's running. You can go to console output. You see our tests, same exact pretty much output. Again, one test failed. We know the reason why it failed, and yep, that's about it. Last thing is our report we generated is right here, that you can also view here and email, or you can create a better version of this report. There is an HTML reporter available that you can install via your npm. But yeah, that's about it. Thanks for your time, guys. Before you go, we really want you to be able to communicate with us. So if there are any questions, guys, if you need any information from me on what we've talked today and covered, you can just find me on here, or you can go directly to Postman. They have great community on Slack. They have great blogs, and everything is available. Okay, and we really want to hear from you guys, so don't just disappear, right? Come meet us for other meetups. That's really exciting. The next meetup is going to be on DevOps for testers, and we've already touched some of it, right? So I'd like to thank you all for your time. Yes.
Yeah, do you guys have anyone has questions for Ivan?
Yes.
Data-driven tests. Is there
Question about data-driven tests. Is there a way in Postman to connect to database to get data directly from the database for the test?
That's a good question, and I did spend a lot of time researching this. And at that time, what I came to the answer I found is that your database has to have HTTP client. If it has the client, then yes, you can write the script and hit it. In my case, I couldn't do it because we have too much security layers around it.
And one more question. So I asked you about the code reusability. From your experience, what are other something that can be improved with the Postman? What something that you can do directly in the code, but not with the Postman? So what are the cons of Postman?
Okay, one thing I really hate, and I've already created an issue, but they didn't fix it, is that we have some pretty complex and crazy tests. We have thousands of lines of code. In one request, there could be hundreds of assertions, and you can imagine how big that can be, right? And so there is no way, unfortunately, for Postman up to today even to point you to the line of code that's failing. It will give you a generic message that something wasn't found or something failed, but I want to see that line, I want to see the reference to click and right away fix it and debug it, because it can get really bad.
Like a stuck trace.
Yes. So that if they would provide that, I would appreciate it. So Postman, if you hear me, please, there is a request on GitHub. Okay, any other questions?
You say that you never invest your money on Postman, but so far I understand that Newman is a paid plugin for Postman. Is that correct?
Not that I know of. No, the plugin I use is free. The Newman is free. The one thing that's paid is not one, but they have monitoring features. They have the different integrations they let you do. Those mock calls are also limited on the free version. I believe there's only 100 of them per month. So if your setup requires more, then you'll have to purchase the paid one.
Okay.
I have a question about the increments which you were testing, and you removed it from Postman, and is it some connection to the databases? I understood it is not, so it means that you always create new ID.
Yes, the way the application is set up is that, and we can expect that, and we want to test that the ID first of all is unique, and the second of all it increments with each new resource.
Is it going to do some rollback because in different databases you switch go back in increment different ways?
Yes, if our flow is hitting the same database, we shouldn't have a problem there. Of course, if you have multiple threads that hit in different databases, you would have to rearrange that test or completely remove it because it's not going to be usable.
And is it a way to do some tricky workflows?
Yeah, you can ask your developers to return the server identifier and then use it in your if-else statement. Like, so let's say if this is the server, then this is the value you're gonna save, and that's what you're gonna work with. If the next request hitting a different database server, you have to be able to identify that in your response body. There's no other way, and then you can work with your if-else statements from there. Okay.
I have a question about the data-driven test as well. So I was going to ask about database, but you already covered it. How about reading from CSV file? You said we can read from CSV file. Is this native capability of Postman itself, or do we have to install plugins or something else? And second question, same question, similar question. Do we have to install plugins, or is it native in order to generate HTML, user-friendly, business people-friendly reports? Thank you.
Yeah, so first question is, it's data-driven, is available out of the box, you don't need any plugins whatsoever. Second question is, yes, to get different types of reports. The one I was using is out of the box. But if you want HTML, there is a plugin and you can find it on Postman. It's pretty easy. You just use the Node package manager and install it.
Thank you.
Have you worked with any other framework to test API besides Postman?
No, this is my only exposure, and what I share with you is what I've been using. I haven't used anything outside this.
There's real API. There's real API with Smart Bear.
Yes.
Upgraded to Postman.
Yeah. Yes. When I joined the company, we were using Ready API from Smart Bear, but it is a paid tool, and when I came, I brought Postman, and we just switched to it, and that saved us a lot of money actually, and improved our test coverage.
Is it only way to do only delays, or not like to do test case by test case like these files?
To insert the delays?
Yeah.
For yes, we can do the script, or we can call the external API from Postman and use it, or use both. They're interchangeable too. Anybody else? Thank you guys. Thank you for your patience. I know it's been a lot to cover, and I know we have a raffle too, if we have time. And so let me pass the microphone.
Sure.
All right. And there are some stickers there, so help yourself. If you don't win anything, you're still gonna get something. You're gonna take home something today. So, all right. Yep.
All right. So did everyone get raffles?